Winter War. The Winter War was a war between the Soviet Union and Finland. It began with a Soviet invasion of Finland on 30 November 1939, 3 months after the outbreak of World War II, and ended 3.5 months later with the Moscow Peace Treaty on 13 March 1940. Despite superior military strength, especially in tanks and aircraft, the Soviet Union suffered severe losses and initially made little headway. The League of Nations deemed the attack illegal and expelled the Soviet Union from its organization. The Soviets made several demands, including that Finland cede substantial border territories in exchange for land elsewhere, claiming security reasons, primarily the protection of Leningrad, 32 kilometers, 20 miles, from the Finnish border. When Finland refused, the Soviets invaded. Most sources conclude that the Soviet Union had intended to conquer all of Finland, and cite the establishment of the puppet Finnish Communist government and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's secret protocols as evidence of this, while other sources argue against the idea of a full Soviet conquest. Finland repelled Soviet attacks for more than 2 months and inflicted substantial losses on the invaders in temperatures as low as -43 degrees Celsius, -45 degrees Fahrenheit. The battles focused mainly on Taipale along the Karelian Isthmus, on Kolla in Ladoga, Karelia, and on Raute Road in Kainuu, but there were also battles in Salla and Petsamo in Lapland. Following the initial setbacks, the Soviets reduced their strategic objectives and put an end to the puppet Finnish Communist government in late January 1940, informing the Finnish government that they were willing to negotiate peace. After the Soviet military reorganized and adopted different tactics, they renewed their offensive in February 1940 and overcame the Finnish defenses on the Karelian Isthmus. This left the Finnish army in the main theater of war near the breaking point, with a retreat seeming inevitable. Consequently, Finnish Commander-in-Chief Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim urged a peace deal with the Soviets, while the Finns still retained bargaining power. Hostilities ceased in March 1940 with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty, in which Finland ceded 9% of its territory to the Soviet Union. Soviet losses were heavy, and the country's international reputation suffered. Their gains exceeded their pre-war demands, and the Soviets received substantial territories along Lake Ladoga and further north. Finland retained its sovereignty and enhanced its international reputation. The poor performance of the Red Army encouraged German Chancellor Adolf Hitler to believe that an attack on the Soviet Union would be successful and confirmed negative Western opinions of the Soviet military. After 15 months of interim peace, in June 1941, Germany commenced Operation Barbarossa, and the continuation war between Finland and the Soviets began. Background: Finnish-Soviet relations and politics. Until the early 19th century, Finland was the eastern part of the Kingdom of Sweden. From the 21st of February 1808 to the 17th of September 1809, the Russian Empire waged the Finnish War against the Kingdom of Sweden, ostensibly to protect the Russian capital, St. Petersburg. Eventually Russia conquered and annexed Finland, and converted it into an autonomous buffer state. The resulting Grand Duchy of Finland enjoyed wide autonomy within Russia until the end of the 19th century, when Russia began attempts to assimilate Finland as part of a general policy to strengthen the central government and unify the empire by Russification. Those attempts were aborted because of Russia's internal strife, but they ruined Russia's relationship with Finland. In addition, support increased in Finland for self-determination movements. World War I led to the collapse of the Russian Empire during the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Russian Civil War. On 15 November 1917, the Bolshevik Russian government declared that national minorities possess the right of self-determination, including the right to secede and form a separate state, which gave Finland a window of opportunity. On 6 December 1917, the Senate of Finland declared the nation's independence. Soviet Russia, later the Soviet Union, recognized the new Finnish government just 3 weeks after the declaration. Finland achieved full sovereignty in May 1918 after a 4-month civil war in which the conservative whites defeated the socialist Reds with the help of the Imperial German Army, pro-German Jaegers, and some Swedish troops, In addition to the expulsion of Bolshevik troops, Finland joined the League of Nations in 1920 and sought security guarantees, but Finland's primary goal was cooperation with the Scandinavian countries, mainly Sweden, and it focused on the exchange of information and on defense planning, the joint defense of a land, for example, rather than on military exercises or on the stockpiling and the deployment of materiel. Nevertheless, Sweden carefully avoided committing itself to Finnish foreign policy. Finland's military policy included clandestine defense cooperation with Estonia. The period after the Finnish Civil War to the early 1930s was a politically unstable time in Finland because of the continued rivalry between the conservatives and the socialists. The Communist Party of Finland was declared illegal in 1931, and the nationalist Lapua movement organized anti-communist violence, which culminated in a failed coup attempt in 1932. The successor of the Lapua movement, the Patriotic People's Movement, had a minor presence in national politics and never had more than 14 seats of the 200 in the Finnish parliament. By the late 1930s, the export-oriented Finnish economy was growing and the nation's extreme political movements had diminished. After Soviet involvement in the Finnish Civil War in 1918, no formal peace treaty was signed. In 1918 and 1919, Finnish volunteers conducted two unsuccessful military incursions across the Soviet border, the Vienna and Ornus expeditions, to annex areas in Karelia that according to the Greater Finland ideology would combine all Baltic Finnish peoples into a single state. In 1920, Finnish communists based in Soviet Russia attempted to assassinate the former Finnish White Guard commander-in-chief, Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim. On 14 October 1920, Finland and Soviet Russia signed the Treaty of Tartu, confirming the old border between the autonomous Grand Duchy of Finland and Imperial Russia proper as the new Finnish-Soviet border. Finland also received Petsamo province, with its ice-free harbor on the Arctic Ocean. Despite the signing of the treaty, relations between the two countries remained strained. The Finnish government allowed volunteers to cross the border to support the East Karelian uprising in Russia in 1921, and Finnish communists in the Soviet Union continued to prepare for revenge and staged a cross-border raid into Finland, the Pork Mutiny, in 1922. In 1932, the Soviet-Finnish Non-Aggression Pact was signed between both countries, and it was reaffirmed for 10 years in 1934. Foreign trade in Finland was booming, but less than 1% of it was with the Soviet Union. In 1934, the Soviet Union also joined the League of Nations. Justification. Soviet General Secretary Joseph Stalin regarded it a disappointment that the Soviet Union could not halt the Finnish Revolution. He thought that the pro-Finland movement in Karelia posed a direct threat to Leningrad and that the area and defenses of Finland could be used to invade the Soviet Union or restrict fleet movements. Soviet propaganda then painted Finland's leadership as a vicious and reactionary fascist clique. Field Marshal Mannerheim and Väinö Tanner, the leader of the Finnish Social Democratic Party, were targeted for particular scorn. When Stalin gained absolute power through the Great Purge of 1938, the Soviets changed their foreign policy toward Finland and began to pursue the reconquest of the provinces of Tsarist Russia that had been lost during the chaos of the October Revolution of 1917 and the Russian Civil War almost 2 decades earlier. Soviet leaders believed that the old empire's extended borders provided territorial security and wanted Leningrad, only 32 kilometers, 20 miles, from the Finnish border, to enjoy a similar level of security against the rising power of Nazi Germany. Negotiations. In April 1938, NKVD agent Boris Yartsev contacted Finnish Foreign Minister Rudolf Holsti and Finnish Prime Minister Amo Kahanda, stating that the Soviets did not trust Germany and that war was considered possible between the two countries. The Red Army would not wait passively behind the border, but would rather advance to meet the enemy. Finnish representatives assured Yartsev that Finland was committed to a policy of neutrality and that the country would resist any armed incursion. Yartsev suggested that Finland cede or lease some islands in the Gulf of Finland along the seaward approaches to Leningrad, but Finland refused. Negotiations continued throughout 1938 without results. The Finnish reception of Soviet entreaties was decidedly cool, as the violent collectivization and purges in Stalin's Soviet Union resulted in a poor opinion of the country. Most of the Finnish communist elite in the Soviet Union had been executed during the Great Purge, further tarnishing the Soviets' image in Finland. Meanwhile, Finland was attempting to negotiate a military cooperation plan with Sweden and hoping to jointly defend the land. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov–Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939. It was publicly a non-aggression treaty, but it included a secret protocol in which Central and Eastern European countries were divided into spheres of influence. Finland fell into the Soviet sphere. On 1 September 1939, Germany began its invasion of Poland, and 2 days later, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany. On 17 September, the Soviet invasion of Poland began. After the fall of Poland, Germany and the Soviet Union exchanged occupied Polish lands to establish a new border in accordance with the provisions of the Molotov–Ribbentrop Pact. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were soon forced to accept treaties that allowed the Soviets to establish military bases on their soil. Estonia accepted the ultimatum by signing the agreement on 28 September. Latvia and Lithuania followed in October. Unlike the three Baltic countries, Finland started a gradual mobilization under the guise of additional refresher training. The Soviets had already started intensive mobilization near the Finnish border in 1938–39. Assault troops thought to be necessary for the invasion did not begin deployment until October 1939. Operational plans made in September called for the invasion to start in November. On 5 October 1939, the Soviets invited a Finnish delegation to Moscow for negotiations. Juho Kusti Paasikivi, the Finnish envoy to Sweden, was sent to Moscow to represent the Finnish government. Furthermore, the negotiations were attended by Stalin in person, signaling the seriousness of the effort. Paasikivi would later recount his surprise over the friendly atmosphere in which the delegation was received, and mentioned the pleasant manners of Stalin towards them. The meetings began on 12 October, with Molotov's offer of a mutual assistance pact, which the Finns immediately refused. To the Finns' surprise, Molotov dropped the offer and instead proposed an exchange of territory. The offer stipulated that the Finnish-Soviet border on the Karelian Isthmus be moved westward to a point only 30 kilometers (19 miles) east of Viipuri, Russian, Vyborg, and that Finland destroy all existing fortifications on the Karelian Isthmus. Likewise, the delegation demanded the cession of islands in the Gulf of Finland as well as Raibehi Peninsula, Finnish, Kalastajasaarento. The Finns would also have to lease the Hanko Peninsula for 30 years and to permit the Soviets to establish a military base there. In exchange, the Soviet Union would cede Repola and Poroharvi from eastern Karelia, 2,120 square miles, an area twice the size as that of the territory demanded from Finland, 1,000 square miles. The Soviet offer divided the Finnish government. Gustav Mannerheim had argued for an agreement, being pessimistic of the Finnish prospects in a war against the Soviet Union. But the Finnish government was reticent in reaching an agreement out of mistrust for Stalin. There was a fear of repeated follow-up demands, which would have put the future of Finnish sovereignty in danger. There were also those, such as Foreign Minister Elias Urho and Prime Minister Amo Kahanda, and the Finnish intelligence in general, who mistook the demands and the Soviet military build-up as a mere bluff on the part of Stalin, and were thus disinclined to reach an agreement. The Finns made two counter-offers to cede the Terijoki area to the Soviet Union. That would double the distance between Leningrad and the Finnish border but was far less than the Soviets had demanded. The Finns would also cede the islands in the Gulf of Finland, but they would not agree to lease any territory to the USSR for military purposes. On the next meeting on 23 October, Stalin conceded to lessen his demands: a reduction in the amount of land demanded in Karelia, a reduction of the Hanko garrison from 5,000 to 4,000 men, and reducing the length of lease from 30 years to whatever date the ongoing Second World War in Europe would end. However, this sudden change, contrary to previous statements that Soviet demands were minimalist and thus unalterable, had surprised the Finnish government, and led them to believe more concession may be forthcoming. Thus, Paasikivi's idea of reaching some sort of compromise by offering the Soviets the island of Jussaro and the fort of Aino were refused by Helsinki. On 31 October, Molotov publicly announced the Soviet demands to the Supreme Soviet. This surprised the Finns, and lent credibility to Soviet claims that their demands were minimalist and thus unalterable, as it would have been impossible to reduce them without a loss of prestige after having made them public. However, the Soviet offer was eventually rejected with respect to the opinion of the public and parliament. At the meeting on 9 November, Paasikivi announced to the attending Stalin and Molotov the Finnish refusal to accept even their reduced demands. The Soviets were visibly surprised. Finnish Foreign Minister Väinö Tanner later wrote that, "The eyes of our opposite numbers opened wide." Stalin had asked, "You don't even offer Aino." This would become the final meeting. The Soviets stopped responding to further Finnish letters, and on 13 November, when the Finnish delegation was recalled from Moscow, no Soviet officials came to see them off. The Finns had left under the expectation that the negotiations would continue. Instead, the Soviet Union ramped up its military preparations. The negotiations had failed, as neither side was willing to substantially reduce their demands, nor was either side able to fully trust the other. The Finns were fearful of an encroachment on their sovereignty, while the Soviets were claiming to be fearful of a springboard for international enemies in Finland, in close proximity to Leningrad. No promises to the contrary managed to persuade the other. Additionally, both sides had misunderstood the other's position. The Finns had assumed that the Soviets had opened up on a maximalist demand, ready to be traded down smaller. The Soviets instead had stressed the minimalist nature of their demands, and were incredulous over Finnish reluctance to agree. Finally, there was also Stalin's unwillingness or inability to accept that any territorial concessions on the part of Finland would have only been possible by a 4/5 majority in the Finnish parliament. He had mocked such a requirement, proposing that they count his and Molotov's votes, too. Shelling of Mainila and Soviet intentions. On 26 November 1939, an incident was reported near the Soviet village of Mainila, near the border with Finland. A Soviet border guard post had been shelled by an unknown party, resulting, according to Soviet reports, in the deaths of 4 and injuries of 9 border guards. Research conducted by several Finnish and Russian historians later concluded that the shelling was a false flag operation since there were no artillery units there, and it was carried out from the Soviet side of the border by an NKVD unit with the purpose of providing the Soviets with a casus belli and a pretext to withdraw from the Non-Aggression Pact. Soviet war games held in March 1938 and 1939 had been based on a scenario in which border incidents taking place at the village of Mainila would spark the war. Molotov claimed that the incident was a Finnish artillery attack. He demanded that Finland apologize for the incident and to move its forces beyond a line 20 to 25 kilometers, 12 to 16 miles, from the border. Finland denied responsibility for the attack, rejected the demands and called for a joint Finnish-Soviet commission to examine the incident. In turn, the Soviet Union claimed that the Finnish response was hostile, renounced the Non-Aggression Pact and severed diplomatic relations with Finland on 28 November. In the following years, Soviet historiography described the incident as Finnish provocation. Doubt on the official Soviet version was cast only in the late 1980s, during the policy of glasnost. The issue has continued to divide Russian historiography even after the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. Soviet intentions. In 2013, Russian President Vladimir Putin stated at a meeting with military historians that the Soviets had launched the Winter War to correct mistakes made in determining the border with Finland after 1917. Opinion on the scale of the initial Soviet invasion decision is divided. The puppet Finnish Communist government and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact secret protocol is used as proof that the Soviet Union had intended to conquer all of Finland. On 1 December 1939, the Soviet Union formed a puppet government, named the Finnish Democratic Republic, to govern Finland after Soviet conquest. A declaration delivered via TASS stated, "The People's Government in its present composition regards itself as a provisional government." Immediately upon arrival in Helsinki, capital of the country, it will be reorganized and its composition enlarged by the inclusion of representatives of the various parties and groups participating in the People's Front of Toilers. Soviet leaflets dropped over Helsinki on the first day of the war stated, "Finnish comrades. We come to you not as conquerors, but as liberators of the Finnish people from the oppression of the capitalists and the landlords." In 1939, Soviet military leadership had formulated a realistic and comprehensive plan for the occupation of Finland. However, Joseph Stalin was not pleased with the conservative pace that the operation required and demanded new plans be drawn up. With the new plans, the key deadline for Finland's capitulation was to be Stalin's 60th birthday on the 21st of December. Convinced of the invasion's forthcoming success, Andrei Zdechenov, chairman of the highest legislative body in the Soviet Union, commissioned a celebratory piece of music from Dmitry Shostakovich, Suite on Finnish Themes, intended to be performed as the marching bands of the Red Army paraded through Helsinki. The Soviets were confident that the Western powers would not come to Finland's aid. Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador to the UK, said, "Who would help? The Swedes, the British, the Americans? There's no way in hell. There will be a fuss in the press, moral support, moaning and whining. But troops, aircraft, cannons, and machine guns, no." Hungarian historian István Ravas wrote that the Soviet Central Committee had set out in 1939 that the former borders of the Tsarist Empire were to be restored, including Finland. American political scientist Dan Reiter stated that the Soviets sought to impose a regime change and thus achieve absolute victory. He quoted Molotov, who had commented in November 1939 on the regime change plan to a Soviet ambassador that the new government will not be Soviet, but one of a democratic republic. "Nobody is going to set up Soviets over there, but we hope it will be a government we can come to terms with as to ensure the security of Leningrad." According to Russian historian Yuri Kilin, the Soviet terms encompass the strongest fortified approaches of the Finnish defenses for a reason. He claimed that Stalin had little hope for such a deal but would play for time for the ongoing mobilization. He stated the objective as being to secure Finland from being used as a staging ground by means of regime change. Others argue against the idea of a complete Soviet conquest. American historian William R. Trotter asserted that Stalin's objective was to secure Leningrad's flank from a possible German invasion through Finland. He stated that, "The strongest argument against a Soviet intention of full conquest is that it did not happen in either 1939 or during the Continuation War in 1944, even though Stalin could have done so with comparative ease." Bradley Lightbody wrote that the entire Soviet aim had been to make the Soviet border more secure. In 2002, Russian historian A. Chubarian stated that no documents had been found in Russian archives that support a Soviet plan to annex Finland. Rather, the objective was to gain Finnish territory and to reinforce Soviet influence in the region. Another American historian, Stephen Kotkin, also shares the position that the Soviet Union did not aim for annexation. He points out the different treatment Finland was given, compared to the Baltics. Unlike the pacts of mutual assistance that the Baltics were pressured into, resulting in their total Sovietization, the Soviets demanded limited territorial concessions from Finland, and even offered land in return, which would not have made sense if full Sovietization was intended. And according to Kotkin, Stalin seemed to be genuinely interested in reaching an agreement during the negotiations. He had personally attended 6 of the 7 meetings with the Finns, and had multiple times reduced his demands. However, mutual mistrust and misunderstandings would mar the negotiations, producing an impasse. Opposing forces. Soviet military plan. Before the war, Soviet leadership had expected total victory within a few weeks. The Red Army had just completed the invasion of eastern Poland at a cost of fewer than 4,000 casualties after Germany attacked Poland from the west. Stalin's expectations of a quick Soviet triumph were backed up by politician Andrei Zdechenov and military strategist Kliment Voroshilov, but other generals were more reserved. Red Army Chief of Staff Boris Shaposhnikov advocated a narrow front assault right on the Karelian Isthmus. Additionally, Shaposhnikov argued for a fuller build-up, extensive fire support and logistical preparations, a rational order of battle and the deployment of the army's best units. Zhdanov's military commander, Kirill Meretskov, reported, "The terrain of coming operations is split by lakes, rivers, swamps, and is almost entirely covered by forests. The proper use of our forces will be difficult." These doubts were not reflected in Meretskov's troop deployments, and he publicly announced that the Finnish campaign would take 2 weeks at most. Soviet soldiers had even been warned not to cross the border mistakenly into Sweden. Stalin's purges in the 1930s had devastated the officer corps of the Red Army. Those purged included 3 of its 5 marshals, 220 of its 264 division or higher-level commanders, and 36,761 officers of all ranks. Fewer than half of all the officers remained. They were commonly replaced by soldiers who were less competent but more loyal to their superiors. Unit commanders were overseen by political commissars, whose approval was needed to approve and ratify military decisions, which they evaluated based on their political merits. The dual system further complicated the Soviet chain of command and annulled the independence of commanding officers. After the Soviet success at the battles of Khalkhin Gol against Japan, on the USSR's eastern border, Soviet High Command had divided into 2 factions. One side was represented by the Spanish Civil War veterans General Pavel Rychagov from the Soviet Air Forces, the tank expert General Dmitry Pavlov and Stalin's favorite general, Marshal Grigory Kulik, the chief of artillery. The other faction was led by Khalkhin Gol veterans General Georgy Zhukov of the Red Army and General Grigory Kravchenko of the Soviet Air Forces. Under this divided command structure, the lessons of the Soviet Union's first real war on a massive scale using tanks, artillery, and aircraft at Khalkhin Gol went unheeded. As a result, Russian BT tanks were less successful. During the Winter War, and it took the Soviet Union 3 months and over 1 million men to accomplish what Zhukov had managed at Khalkhin Gol in 10 days, albeit in completely different circumstances. Soviet order of battle. Soviet generals were impressed by the success of German blitzkrieg tactics, but they had been tailored to conditions in Central Europe, with its dense well-mapped network of paved roads. Armies fighting there had recognized supply and communication centers, which could be easily targeted by armored vehicle regiments. Finnish army centers, in contrast, were deep inside the country. There were no paved roads, and even gravel or dirt roads was scarce. Most of the terrain consisted of trackless forests and swamps. The war correspondent John Langdon Davies observed the landscape. Every acre of its surface was created to be the despair of an attacking military force. Waging blitzkrieg in Finland was a highly difficult proposition, and according to Trotter, the Red Army failed to meet the level of tactical coordination and local initiative that would be required to execute such tactics in Finland. Commander of the Leningrad Military District Kirill Meretskov initially ran the overall operation against the Finns. The command was passed on 9 December 1939 to the General Staff Supreme Command, later known as Stavka, directly under Kliment Voroshilov, Chairman, Nikolai Kuznetsov, Stalin and Boris Shaposhnikov. On 28 December, when Stalin asked for volunteers to take over military command, Semyon Timoshenko offered himself on the condition that he be allowed to implement Shaposhnikov's initial plan of a focused attack on the Karelian Isthmus to break the Mannerheim Line. It was accepted. In January 1940, the Leningrad Military District was reformed and renamed Northwestern Front. The Soviet forces were organized as follows: the 7th Army, comprising 9 divisions, a tank corps and 3 tank brigades, was located on the Karelian Isthmus. Its objective was to quickly overrun the Finnish defenses on the Karelian Isthmus and conquer Viipuri. From there, the 7th Army was to continue towards Lappeenranta, then turn west towards Lahti, before the final push to the capital Helsinki. The force was later divided into the 7th and 13th Armies. The 8th Army, comprising 6 divisions and a tank brigade, was north of Lake Ladoga. Its mission was to execute a flanking maneuver around the northern shore of Lake Ladoga to strike at the rear of the Mannerheim Line. The 9th Army was positioned to strike into central Finland through the Kainuu region. It was composed of 3 divisions with 1 more on its way. Its mission was to thrust westward to cut Finland in half. The 14th Army, comprising 3 divisions, was based in Murmansk. Its objectives were to capture the Arctic port of Petsamo and then advance to the town of Rovaniemi. Finnish order of battle. The Finnish strategy was dictated by geography. The 1,340 kilometers (830 miles) border with the Soviet Union was mostly impassable except along a handful of unpaved roads. In pre-war calculations, the Finnish Defense Command, which had established its wartime headquarters at Mikkeli, had estimated 7 Soviet divisions on the Karelian Isthmus and no more than 5 along the whole border north of Lake Ladoga. In the estimation, the manpower ratio would have favored the attacker by 3-1. The true ratio was much higher, however, since, for example, 12 Soviet divisions were deployed north of Lake Ladoga. Finland had a large force of reservists, which was trained in regular maneuvers, some of which had experience from the recent Finnish Civil War. The soldiers were also almost universally trained in basic survival techniques, such as skiing. The Finnish army was not able to equip all its soldiers with proper uniforms at the outbreak of war, but its reservists were equipped with warm civilian clothing. However, the sparsely populated highly agrarian Finland had to draft so many of its working men that the Finnish economy was massively strained because of a lack of workers. An even greater problem than lack of soldiers was the lack of materiel, since foreign shipments of anti-tank weapons and aircraft were arriving only in small quantities. The ammunition situation was alarming, as stockpiles had cartridges, shells and fuel to last only 19 to 60 days. The ammunition shortage meant the Finns could seldom afford counter-battery or saturation fire. Finnish tank forces were operationally non-existent. The ammunition situation was alleviated somewhat since Finns were largely armed with Mosin Nagant rifles dating from the Finnish Civil War, which used the same 7.62 x 54 mmR cartridge that was used by Soviet forces. The situation was so severe that Finnish soldiers sometimes had to maintain their ammunition supply by looting the bodies of dead Soviet soldiers. The Finnish forces were positioned as follows. The Army of the Isthmus was composed of 6 divisions under the command of Hugo Osterman. The 2nd Army Corps was positioned on its right flank and the 3rd Army Corps on its left flank. The 4th Army Corps was located north of Lake Ladoga. It was composed of 2 divisions under Juho Heiskanen, who was soon replaced by Waldemar Hageland. The North Finland Group was a collection of White Guards, Border Guards and drafted reservist units under Wiljo Tuompo. Soviet invasion. Start of invasion and political operations. On 30 November 1939, Soviet forces invaded Finland with 21 divisions, totaling 450,000 men, and bombed Helsinki, killing about 100 citizens and destroying more than 50 buildings. In response to international criticism, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov stated that the Soviet Air Force was not bombing Finnish cities but rather dropping humanitarian aid to the starving Finnish population. The bombs were sarcastically dubbed Molotov bread baskets by Finns. The Finnish statesman J.K. Paasikivi commented that the Soviet attack without a declaration of war violated 3 separate non-aggression pacts: the Treaty of Tartu, which was signed in 1920, the Non-Aggression Pact between Finland and the Soviet Union, which was signed in 1932 and again in 1934, and also the Covenant of the League of Nations, which the Soviet Union signed in 1934. Field Marshal C.G.E. Mannerheim was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Defence Forces after the Soviet attack. In a further reshuffling, Amo Kahanda's caretaker cabinet was replaced by Risto Rati and his cabinet, with Vaino Tanner as foreign minister because of opposition to Kahanda's pre-war politics. Finland brought the matter of the Soviet invasion before the League of Nations. The League expelled the Soviet Union on 14 December 1939 and exhorted its members to aid Finland. Headed by Otto Will Kuusinen, the Finnish Democratic Republic puppet government operated in the parts of Finnish Karelia occupied by the Soviets, and was also referred to as the Terijoki government, after the village of Terijoki, the first settlement captured by the advancing Red Army. After the war, the puppet government was reabsorbed into the Soviet Union. From the very outset of the war, working-class Finns stood behind the legitimate government in Helsinki. Finnish national unity against the Soviet invasion was later called the spirit of the Winter War. First battles and Soviet advance to Mannerheim Line. The array of Finnish defense structures that during the war started to be called the Mannerheim Line was located on the Karelian Isthmus, approximately 30 to 75 kilometers, 19 to 47 miles, from the Soviet border. The Red Army soldiers on the isthmus numbered 250,000, facing 130,000 Finns. The Finnish command deployed a defense in depth of about 21,000 men in the area in front of the Mannerheim Line to delay and damage the Red Army before it reached the line. In combat, the most severe cause of confusion among Finnish soldiers was Soviet tanks. The Finns had few anti-tank weapons and insufficient training in modern anti-tank tactics. According to Trotter, the favored Soviet armored tactic was a simple frontal charge, the weaknesses of which could be exploited. The Finns learned that at close range, tanks could be dealt with in many ways. For example, logs and crowbars jammed into the bogie wheels would often immobilize a tank. Soon, Finns fielded a better ad hoc weapon, the Molotov cocktail, a glass bottle filled with flammable liquids and with a simple hand-lit fuse. Molotov cocktails were eventually mass-produced by the Finnish Alco-Alcoholic Beverage Corporation and bundled with matches with which to light them. 80 Soviet tanks were destroyed in the border zone engagements. By the 6th of December, all of the Finnish covering forces had withdrawn to the Mannerheim Line. The Red Army began its first major attack against the line in Taipale, the area between the shore of Lake Ladoga, the Taipale River and the Savanto waterway. Along the Savanto sector, the Finns had a slight advantage of elevation and dry ground to dig into. The Finnish artillery had scouted the area and made fire plans in advance, anticipating a Soviet assault. The Battle of Taipale began with a 40-hour Soviet artillery preparation. After the barrage, Soviet infantry attacked across open ground but was repulsed with heavy casualties. From 6 to 12 December, the Red Army continued to try to engage using only a single division. Next, the Red Army strengthened its artillery and deployed tanks and the 150th Rifle Division forward to the Taipale front. On 14 December, the bolstered Soviet forces launched a new attack but were pushed back again. A third Soviet division entered the fight but performed poorly and panicked under shell fire. The assaults continued without success, and the Red Army suffered heavy losses. One typical Soviet attack during the battle lasted just an hour but left 1,000 dead and 27 tanks strewn on the ice. North of Lake Ladoga on the Ladoga-Karelia front, the defending Finnish units relied on the terrain. Ladoga-Karelia, a large forest wilderness, did not have road networks for the modern Red Army. The Soviet Eighth Army had extended a new railroad line to the border, which could double the supply capability on the front. On 12 December, the advancing Soviet 139th Rifle Division, supported by the 56th Rifle Division, was defeated by a much smaller Finnish force under Paavo Talvela in Tolvaharvi, the first Finnish victory of the war. In central and northern Finland, roads were few and the terrain hostile. The Finns did not expect large-scale Soviet attacks, but the Soviets sent 8 divisions, heavily supported by armor and artillery. The 155th Rifle Division attacked at Lieksa, and further north the 44th attacked at Kumo. The 163rd Rifle Division was deployed at Suomussalmi and ordered to cut Finland in half by advancing on the Raute Road. In Finnish Lapland, the Soviet 88th and 122nd Rifle Divisions attacked at Salla. The Arctic port of Petsamo was attacked by the 104th Mountain Rifle Division by sea and land, supported by naval gunfire. Operations from December to January. Weather conditions. The winter of 1939–40 was exceptionally cold, with the Karelian Isthmus experiencing a record low temperature of -43°C, -45°F, on 16 January 1940. At the beginning of the war, only those Finnish soldiers who were in active service had uniforms and weapons. The rest had to make do with their own clothing, which for many soldiers was their normal winter clothing with a semblance of insignia added. Finnish soldiers were skilled in cross-country skiing. The cold, snow, forest, and long hours of darkness were factors that the Finns could use to their advantage. The Finns dressed in layers, and the ski troopers wore a lightweight white snow cape. This snow camouflage made the ski troopers almost invisible so that they could more easily execute guerrilla attacks against Soviet columns. At the beginning of the war, Soviet tanks were painted in standard olive drab and men dressed in regular khaki uniforms. Not until late January 1940 did the Soviets paint their equipment white and issue snowsuits to their infantry. Most Soviet soldiers had proper winter clothes, but this was not the case with every unit. In the Battle of Suomussalmi, thousands of Soviet soldiers died of frostbite. The Soviet troops also lacked skill in skiing, so soldiers were restricted to movement by road and were forced to move in long columns. The Red Army lacked proper winter tents, and troops had to sleep in improvised shelters. Some Soviet units incurred frostbite casualties as high as 10% even before crossing the Finnish border. However, the cold weather did give an advantage to Soviet tanks, as they could move over frozen terrain and bodies of water, rather than being immobilized in swamps and mud. According to Krivosheyev, at least 61,506 Soviet troops were sick or frostbitten during the war. Finnish guerrilla tactics. In battles from Ladoga, Karelia to the Arctic port of Petsamo, the Finns used guerrilla tactics. The Red Army was superior in numbers and material, but Finns used the advantages of speed, maneuver warfare and economy of force. Particularly on the Ladoga-Karelia front and during the Battle of Rate Road, the Finns isolated smaller portions of numerically superior Soviet forces. With Soviet forces divided into smaller groups, the Finns dealt with them individually and attacked from all sides. For many of the encircled Soviet troops in a pocket, called a motti in Finnish, originally meaning 1 meter 35 cubic feet, of firewood, staying alive was an ordeal comparable to combat. The men were freezing and starving and endured poor sanitary conditions. Historian William R. Trotter described these conditions as follows: the Soviet soldier had no choice. If he refused to fight, he would be shot. If he tried to sneak through the forest, he would freeze to death. And surrender was no option for him. Soviet propaganda had told him how the Finns would torture prisoners to death. The problem, however, was that the Finns were mostly too weak to fully exploit their success. Some of the pockets of encircled Soviet soldiers held out for weeks and even months, binding a huge number of Finnish forces. Battles of the Mannerheim Line. The terrain on the Karelian Isthmus did not allow guerrilla tactics, so the Finns were forced to resort to the more conventional Mannerheim Line, with its flanks protected by large bodies of water. Soviet propaganda claimed that it was as strong as or even stronger than the Maginot Line. Finnish historians, for their part, have belittled the line's strength, insisting that it was mostly conventional trenches and log-covered dugouts. The Finns had built 221 strong points along the Karelian Isthmus, mostly in the early 1920s. Many were extended in the late 1930s. Despite these defensive preparations, even the most fortified section of the Mannerheim Line had only one reinforced concrete bunker per kilometer. Overall, the line was weaker than similar lines in mainland Europe. According to the Finns, the real strength of the line was the stubborn defenders with a lot of sisu, a Finnish idiom roughly translated as guts, fighting spirit. On the eastern side of the isthmus, the Red Army attempted to break through the Mannerheim Line at the Battle of Taipale. On the western side, Soviet units faced the Finnish line at Summa, near the city of Viipuri, on 16 December. The Finns had built 41 reinforced concrete bunkers in the Summa area, making the defensive line in this area stronger than anywhere else on the Karelian Isthmus. Because of a mistake in planning, the nearby Manasuo swamp had a 1 kilometer (0.62 miles) wide gap in the line. During the First Battle of Summa, a number of Soviet tanks broke through the thin line on 19 December, but the Soviets could not benefit from the situation because of insufficient cooperation between branches of service. The Finns remained in their trenches, allowing the Soviet tanks to move freely behind the Finnish line, as the Finns had no proper anti-tank weapons. The Finns succeeded in repelling the main Soviet assault. The tanks, stranded behind enemy lines, attacked the strongpoints at random until they were eventually destroyed, 20 in all. By the 22nd of December, the battle ended in a Finnish victory. The Soviet advance was stopped at the Mannerheim Line. Red Army troops suffered from poor morale and a shortage of supplies, eventually refusing to participate in more suicidal frontal attacks. The Finns, led by General Harold Åquist, decided to launch a counterattack and encircle 3 Soviet divisions into a motti near Viipuri on 23 December. Åquist's plan was bold, however it failed. The Finns lost 1,300 men, and the Soviets were later estimated to have lost a similar number. Battles in Ladoga, Karelia and North Karelia. The strength of the Red Army north of Lake Ladoga in Ladoga, Karelia surprised the Finnish headquarters. 2 Finnish divisions were deployed there, the 12th Division led by Lauri Tiainen and the 13th Division led by Hannu Hanuksala. They also had a support group of 3 brigades, bringing their total strength to over 30,000. The Soviets deployed a division for almost every road leading west to the Finnish border. The 8th Army was led by Ivan Khabarov, who was replaced by Grigory Stern on 13 December. The Soviets' mission was to destroy the Finnish troops in the area of Ladoga, Karelia and advance into the area between Sortavala and Joensuu within 10 days. The Soviets had a 3-to-1 advantage in manpower and a 5-to-1 advantage in artillery, as well as air supremacy. Finnish forces panicked and retreated in front of the overwhelming Red Army. The commander of the Finnish 4th Army Corps, Juho Heiskanen, was replaced by Waldemar Hageland on 4 December. On 7 December, in the middle of the Ladoga-Karelian front, Finnish units retreated near the small stream of Kolla. The waterway itself did not offer protection, but alongside it, there were ridges up to 10 meters, 33 feet, high. The ensuing Battle of Kolla lasted until the end of the war. A memorable quote, "Kolla holds," Finnish, Kolla kestar, became a legendary motto among Finns. Further contributing to the legend of Kolla was the sniper Simo Heiha, dubbed the White Death in Finnish media, and credited with over 500 kills. Captain Arne Jutalainen, dubbed the Terror of Morocco, also became a living legend in the Battle of Kolla. To the north, the Finns retreated from Aglaharvi to Tolvaharvi on 5 December and then repelled a Soviet offensive in the Battle of Tolvaharvi on 11 December. In the south, 2 Soviet divisions were united on the northern side of the Lake Ladoga coastal road. As before, these divisions were trapped as the more mobile Finnish units counterattacked from the north to flank the Soviet columns. On 19 December, the Finns temporarily ceased their assaults due to exhaustion. It was not until the period of 6 to 16 January 1940 that the Finns resumed their offensive, dividing Soviet divisions into smaller mottis. Contrary to Finnish expectations, the encircled Soviet divisions did not try to break through to the east but instead entrenched. They were expecting reinforcements and supplies to arrive by air. As the Finns lacked the necessary heavy artillery equipment and were short of men, they often did not directly attack the mottis they had created. Instead, they worked to eliminate only the most dangerous threats. Often the motti tactic was not applied as a strategy, but as a Finnish adaptation to the behavior of Soviet troops under fire. In spite of the cold and hunger, the Soviet troops did not surrender easily but fought bravely, often entrenching their tanks to be used as pillboxes and building timber dugouts. Some specialist Finnish soldiers were called in to attack the Mottis. The most famous of them was Major Matti Aarnio, or Motti Matti, as he became known. In North Karelia, Soviet forces were outmaneuvered at Ilomantsi and Lieksa. The Finns used effective guerrilla tactics, taking special advantage of their superior skiing skills and snow-white layered clothing and executing surprise ambushes and raids. By the end of December, the Soviets decided to retreat and transfer resources to more critical fronts. Battles in Kainuu. The Suomussalmi Raate engagement was a double operation which would later be used by military academics as a classic example of what well-led troops and innovative tactics can do against a much larger adversary. Suomussalmi was a municipality of 4,000 with long lakes, wild forests and few roads. The Finnish command believed that the Soviets would not attack there, but the Red Army committed 2 divisions to the Kainuu area with orders to cross the wilderness, capture the city of Oulu and effectively cut Finland in 2. There were 2 roads leading to Suomussalmi from the frontier, the northern Juntusranta Road and the southern Raate Road. The Battle of Raate Road, which occurred during the month-long Battle of Suomussalmi, resulted in one of the largest Soviet losses in the Winter War. The Soviet 44th and parts of the 163rd Rifle Division, comprising about 14,000 troops, were almost completely destroyed by a Finnish ambush as they marched along the forest road. A small unit blocked the Soviet advance while Finnish Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo and his 9th Division cut off the retreat route, split the enemy force into smaller mottis, and then proceeded to destroy the remnants in detail as they retreated. The Soviets suffered 7,000 to 9,000 casualties, the Finnish units, 400. The Finnish troops captured dozens of tanks, artillery pieces, anti-tank guns, hundreds of trucks, almost 2,000 horses, thousands of rifles, and much-needed ammunition and medical supplies. So sure of their victory had the Soviets been that a military band, complete with instruments, banners and notes, was traveling with the 44th Division to perform in a victory parade. The Finns found their instruments among the captured materiel. Battles in Finnish Lapland. The Finnish area of Lapland, best riding the Arctic Circle, is sparsely developed, with little daylight and persistent snow cover during winter. The Finns expected nothing more than raiding parties and reconnaissance patrols. Instead, the Soviets sent full divisions. On the 11th of December, the Finns rearranged the defense of Lapland and detached the Lapland Group from the North Finland Group. The group was placed under the command of Kurt Wallenius. In southern Lapland, near the village of Salla, the Soviet 88th and 122nd Divisions, totaling 35,000 men, advanced. In the Battle of Salla, the Soviets proceeded easily to Salla, where the road split. Further ahead was Kemijärvi, while the fork to Pelkosenniemi led northwest. On the 17th of December, the Soviet Northern Group, comprising an infantry regiment, a battalion, and a company of tanks, was outflanked by a Finnish battalion. The 122nd retreated, abandoning much of its heavy equipment and vehicles. Following this success, the Finns shuttled reinforcements to the defensive line in front of Kemijärvi. The Soviets hammered the defensive line without success. The Finns counter-attacked, and the Soviets retreated to a new defensive line where they stayed for the rest of the war. To the north was Finland's only ice-free port in the Arctic, Petsamo. The Finns lacked the manpower to defend it fully, as the main front was distant at the Karelian Isthmus. In the Battle of Petsamo, the Soviet 104th Division attacked the Finnish 104th Independent Cover Company. The Finns abandoned Petsamo and concentrated on delaying actions. The area was treeless, windy, and relatively low, offering little defensible terrain. The almost constant darkness and extreme temperatures of the Lapland winter benefited the Finns, who executed guerrilla attacks against Soviet supply lines and patrols. As a result, the Soviet movements were halted by the efforts of one-fifth as many Finns. Aerial warfare. Soviet Air Force. The USSR enjoyed air superiority throughout the war. The Soviet Air Force, supporting the Red Army's invasion with about 2,500 aircraft, the most common type being Tupolev SB, was not as effective as the Soviets might have hoped. The material damage by the bomb raids was slight as Finland offered few valuable targets for strategic bombing. For example, the city of Tampere was one of the most important targets because it was an important railway junction, and also housed State Aircraft Factory and the Tampere linen and iron industry premises, which manufactured munitions and weapons, including grenade launchers. Often, targets were village depots with little value. The country had few modern highways in the interior, therefore making the railways the main targets for bombers. Rail tracks were cut thousands of times, but the Finns hastily repaired them and service resumed within a matter of hours. The Soviet Air Force learned from its early mistakes, and by late February instituted more effective tactics. The largest bombing raid against the capital of Finland, Helsinki, occurred on the first day of the war. The capital was bombed only a few times thereafter. All in all, Soviet bombings cost Finland 5% of its total man-hour production. Nevertheless, Soviet air attacks affected thousands of civilians, killing 957. The Soviets recorded 2,075 bombing attacks in 516 localities. The city of Viipuri, a major Soviet objective close to the Karelian Isthmus front, was almost leveled by nearly 12,000 bombs. No attacks on civilian targets were mentioned in Soviet radio or newspaper reports. In January 1940, the Soviet Pravda newspaper continued to lie that no civilian targets in Finland had been struck, even accidentally. It is estimated that the Soviet Air Force lost about 400 aircraft because of inclement weather, lack of fuel and tools, and during transport to the front. The Soviet Air Force flew approximately 44,000 sorties during the war. Finnish Air Force. At the beginning of the war, Finland had a small air force, with only 114 combat planes fit for duty. Missions were limited, and fighter aircraft were mainly used to repel Soviet bombers. Strategic bombings doubled as opportunities for military reconnaissance. Old-fashioned and few in number, aircraft offered little support for Finnish ground troops. In spite of losses, the number of planes in the Finnish Air Force rose by over 50% by the end of the war. The Finns received shipments of British, French, Italian, Swedish and American aircraft. Finnish fighter pilots often flew their motley collection of planes into Soviet formations that outnumbered them 10 or even 20 times. Finnish fighters shot down 200 Soviet aircraft, while losing 62 of their own on all causes. Finnish anti-aircraft guns downed more than 300 enemy aircraft. Often, a Finnish forward airbase consisted of a frozen lake, a windsock, a telephone set and some tents. Air raid warnings were given by Finnish women organized by the Lotta Svard. The top-scoring fighter ace was Jorma Sarvanto, with 12.83 victories. He would increase his tally during the continuation war. Naval warfare. Naval activity. There was little naval activity during the Winter War. The Baltic Sea began to freeze over by the end of December, impeding the movement of warships. By midwinter, only icebreakers and submarines could still move. The other reason for low naval activity was the nature of Soviet Navy forces in the area. The Baltic Fleet was a coastal defense force which did not have the training, logistical structure, or landing craft to undertake large-scale operations. The Baltic Fleet possessed 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, almost 20 destroyers, 50 motor torpedo boats, 52 submarines, and other miscellaneous vessels. The Soviets used naval bases in Paldiski, Tallinn and Liepāja for their operations. The Finnish Navy was a coastal defense force with 2 coastal defense ships, 5 submarines, 4 gunboats, 7 motor torpedo boats, 1 minelayer and 6 minesweepers and at least 5 icebreakers. The 2 coastal defense ships, Ilmarinen and Vanemoinen, were moved to harbor in Turku where they were used to bolster the air defense. Their anti-aircraft guns shot down 1 or 2 planes over the city, and the ships remained there for the rest of the war. At the 18th of January, Finnish armed icebreaker Tarmo was severely damaged at Kotka, received 2 bombs from a Soviet bomber with 39 Finnish troops killed in action. As well as coastal defense, The Finnish Navy protected the Ålandish and Finnish merchant vessels in the Baltic Sea. Soviet aircraft bombed Finnish vessels and harbors and dropped mines into Finnish seaways. Still, only 5 merchant ships were lost to Soviet action. World War II, which had started before the Winter War, proved more costly for the Finnish merchant vessels, with 26 lost due to hostile action in 1939 and 1940. Coastal artillery. Finnish coastal artillery batteries defended important harbors and naval bases. Most batteries were left over from the Imperial Russian period, with 152 mm (6.0 in) guns being the most numerous. Finland attempted to modernize its old guns and installed a number of new batteries, the largest of which featured a 305 mm (12.0 in) gun battery on the island of Kuivasaari in front of Helsinki, originally intended to block the Gulf of Finland to Soviet ships with the help of batteries on the Estonian side. The first naval battle occurred in the Gulf of Finland on 1 December, near the island of Russaro, 5 km (3.1 miles) south of Hanko. That day, the weather was fair and visibility was excellent. The Finns spotted the Soviet cruiser Kirov and 2 destroyers. When the ships were at a range of 24 km (13 nmi) 15 miles, the Finns opened fire with 4 234 mm (9.2 in) coastal guns. After 5 minutes of firing by the coastal guns, the cruiser had been damaged by near misses and retreated. The destroyers remained undamaged, but the Kirov suffered 17 dead and 30 wounded. The Soviets already knew the locations of the Finnish coastal batteries, but were surprised by their range. Coastal artillery had a greater effect on land by reinforcing defense in conjunction with army artillery. 2 sets of fortress artillery made significant contributions to the early battles on the Karelian Isthmus and in Ladoga, Karelia. These were located at Karnajoki on the eastern isthmus and at Mantsi on the northeastern shore of Lake Ladoga. The fortress of Koivisto provided similar support from the southwestern coast of the isthmus. Soviet breakthrough in February. Red Army reforms and offensive preparations. Joseph Stalin was not pleased with the results of December 1939 in the Finnish campaign. The Red Army had been humiliated in defeats by smaller Finnish forces. By the third week of the war, Soviet propaganda was already working to explain the failures of the Soviet military to the populace, blaming bad terrain and harsh climate, and falsely claiming that the Mannerheim Line was stronger than the Maginot Line, and that the Americans had sent 1,000 of their best pilots to Finland. However, the Soviets were confronted with the unavoidable reality of the poor performance of their troops against the Finns. Stalin in particular was concerned about the effects of the war on Soviet reputation. In late December, the Soviets decided to reduce their strategic objectives and focused on bringing the war to an end. Chief of Staff Boris Shaposhnikov was given full authority over operations in the Finnish theatre, and he ordered the suspension of frontal assaults in late December. Kliment Voroshilov was replaced with Semyon Timoshenko as the commander of the Soviet forces in the war on 7 January 1940. The main focus of the Soviet attack was switched to the Karelian Isthmus. Timoshenko and Zdechnov reorganized and tightened control between different branches of service in the Red Army. They also changed tactical doctrines to meet the realities of the situation. The Soviet forces on the Karelian Isthmus were divided into 2 armies, the 7th and the 13th Army. The 7th Army, now under Kirill Meretskov, would concentrate 75% of its strength against the 16 km (9.9 miles) stretch of the Mannerheim Line between Taipale and the Munnasuo Swamp. Tactics would be basic: an armored wedge for the initial breakthrough, followed by the main infantry and vehicle assault force. The Red Army would prepare by pinpointing the Finnish frontline fortifications. The 123rd Rifle Division then rehearsed the assault on life-size mock-ups. The Soviets shipped large numbers of new tanks and artillery pieces to the theater. Troops were increased from 10 divisions to 25 to 26 divisions with 6 or 7 tank brigades and several independent tank platoons as support, totaling 600,000 soldiers. On 1 February, the Red Army began a large offensive, firing 300,000 shells into the Finnish line in the first 24 hours of the bombardment. Soviet offensive on the Karelian Isthmus. Although the Karelian Isthmus front was less active in January than in December, the Soviets increased bombardments, wearing down the defenders and softening their fortifications. During daylight hours, the Finns took shelter inside their fortifications from the bombardments and repaired damage during the night. The situation led quickly to war exhaustion among the Finns, who lost over 3,000 soldiers in trench warfare. The Soviets also made occasional small infantry assaults with 1 or 2 companies. Because of the shortage of ammunition, Finnish artillery emplacements were under orders to fire only against directly threatening ground attacks. On the 1st of February, the Soviets further escalated their artillery and air bombardments. Although the Soviets refined their tactics and morale improved, the generals were still willing to accept massive losses to reach their objectives. Soviet attacks were now being screened by smoke, heavy artillery, and armor support, but the infantry charged in the open and in dense formations. Unlike their tactics in December, Soviet tanks advanced in smaller numbers. The Finns could not easily eliminate tanks if infantry troops protected them. After 10 days of constant artillery barrage, the Soviets achieved a breakthrough on the western Karelian Isthmus in the Second Battle of Suma. By the 11th of February, the Soviets had approximately 460,000 soldiers, 3,350 artillery pieces, 3,000 tanks and 1,300 aircraft deployed on the Karelian Isthmus. The Red Army was constantly receiving new recruits after the breakthrough. Opposing them, the Finns had 8 divisions, totaling about 150,000 soldiers. One by one, the defenders' strongholds crumbled under the Soviet attacks and the Finns were forced to retreat. On the 15th of February, Mannerheim authorized a general retreat of the Second Corps to a fallback line of defense. On the eastern side of the isthmus, the Finns continued to resist Soviet assaults, achieving a stalemate in the Battle of Taipale. Peace negotiations. Although the Finns attempted to reopen negotiations with Moscow by every means during the war, the Soviets did not respond. In early January, Finnish communist Hella Wuolijoki contacted the Finnish government. She offered to contact Moscow through the Soviet Union's ambassador to Sweden, Alexandra Kollontai. Wuolijoki departed for Stockholm and met Kollontai secretly at a hotel. On the 29th of January, Molotov put an end to the puppet Teriyaki government and recognized the Rati Tanner government as the legal government of Finland, informing it that the USSR was willing to negotiate peace. By mid-February, it became clear that the Finnish forces were rapidly approaching exhaustion. For the Soviets, casualties were high. The situation was a source of political embarrassment to the Soviet regime, and there was a risk of Franco-British intervention, which was overestimated by Soviet intelligence in February and March 1940. With the spring thaw approaching, the Soviet forces risked becoming bogged down in the forests. Finnish Foreign Minister Väinö Tanner arrived in Stockholm on the 12th of February and negotiated the peace terms with the Soviets through the Swedes. German representatives, not aware that the negotiations were underway, suggested on the 17th of February that Finland negotiate with the Soviet Union. Both Germany and Sweden were keen to see an end to the Winter War. The Germans feared losing the iron ore fields in northern Sweden and threatened to attack at once if the Swedes granted the Allied forces right of passage. The German invasion plan, named Study Nord, was later implemented as Operation Weserübung. Leon Trotsky opined after the war that Hitler would view a Soviet occupation of Finland as a threat to this plan. Any potential German plans for bases in Finland would also be thwarted if the Soviets occupied Finland, though Trotsky himself believed that Hitler was not interested in occupying Finland, but rather its role as a buffer between Germany and the USSR. As the Finnish cabinet hesitated in the face of harsh Soviet conditions, Sweden's King Gustav V made a public statement on the 19th of February in which he confirmed having declined Finnish pleas for support from Swedish troops. On the 25th of February, the Soviet peace terms were spelt out in detail. On the 29th of February, The Finnish government accepted the Soviet terms in principle and was willing to enter into negotiations. Red Army commanders wished to continue the war as their forces were starting to make progress against the Finns, whereas the Communist Party pointed out that the war was becoming too costly and called for the signing of a peace treaty. The party believed that Finland could be taken over later by means of a revolution. The heated discussion that ensued failed to yield any clear result, and the matter went to a vote, in which the party's opinion prevailed and the decision was taken to bring hostilities to an end. End of war in March. On the 5th of March, the Red Army advanced 10 to 15 kilometers, 6.2 to 9.3 miles, past the Mannerheim Line and entered the suburbs of Viipuri. The same day, the Red Army established a beachhead on the western Gulf of Viipuri. The Finns proposed an armistice on the 6th of March, but the Soviets, wanting to keep the pressure on the Finnish government, declined the offer. The Finnish peace delegation traveled to Moscow via Stockholm and arrived on the 7th of March. They were disappointed to find that Stalin was not present during peace negotiations, likely due to the Red Army's humiliation by the Finns. The Soviets had further demands, as their military position was strong and improving. On the 9th of March, the Finnish military situation on the Karelian Isthmus was dire, as troops were experiencing heavy casualties. Artillery ammunition was exhausted and weapons were wearing out. The Finnish government, realizing that the hoped-for Franco-British military expedition would not arrive in time, as Norway and Sweden had not given the Allies right of passage, had little choice but to accept the Soviet terms. Finnish President Kyösti Kallio resisted the idea of giving up any territory to the Soviet Union, but eventually agreed to sign the Moscow Peace Treaty. When he signed the document, the tormented president uttered the well-known words, "Let the hand wither that signs this monstrous treaty." Moscow Peace Treaty. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed in Moscow on the 12th of March 1940. A ceasefire took effect the next day at noon Leningrad time, 11 a.m. Helsinki time. With it, Finland ceded the Karelian Isthmus and most of Ladoga, Karelia. The area included Viipuri, Finland's second-largest city or fourth-largest city, depending on the census data, much of Finland's industrialized territory, and significant lands still held by Finland's military, all in all, 9% of Finnish territory. The ceded territory included 13% of Finland's economic assets. 12% of Finland's population, 422,000 to 450,000 Karelians, were evacuated and lost their homes. Finland also ceded a part of the region of Salla, the Raibehi Peninsula in the Barents Sea, and 4 islands in the Gulf of Finland. The Hanko Peninsula was leased to the Soviet Union as a military base for 30 years. The region of Petsamo, captured by the Red Army during the war, was returned to Finland according to the treaty. Finnish concessions and territorial losses exceeded Soviet pre-war demands. Before the war, the Soviet Union demanded for the frontier with Finland on the Karelian Isthmus to be moved westward to a point 30 kilometers, 19 miles, east of Viipuri to the line between Koivisto and Lipola, for existing fortifications on the Karelian Isthmus to be demolished and for the islands of Suosaari, Tiitasaari, and Koivisto in the Gulf of Finland and Raibehi Peninsula to be ceded. In exchange, the Soviet Union proposed to cede Ripola and Poraharvi from eastern Karelia, an area twice as large as the territories that were originally demanded from the Finns. Foreign support. Foreign volunteers. World opinion largely supported the Finnish cause, and the Soviet aggression was generally deemed unjustified. World War II had not yet directly affected France, the United Kingdom or the United States. The Winter War was practically the only conflict in Europe at that time and thus held major world interest. Several foreign organizations sent material aid, and many countries granted credit and military materiel to Finland. Nazi Germany allowed arms to pass through its territory to Finland, but after a Swedish newspaper made this public, Adolf Hitler initiated a policy of silence towards Finland, as part of improved German-Soviet relations following the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The largest foreign contingent came from neighboring Sweden, which provided nearly 8,760 volunteers during the war. The volunteer corps was formed of predominantly Swedes, as well as 1,010 Danes and 727 Norwegians. They fought on the northern front at Salur during the last days of the war. A Swedish unit of Gloucester Gladiator fighters, named the Flight Regiment 19 inches, also participated. Swedish anti-air batteries with Bofors 40 mm, 1.6 in guns were responsible for air defense in northern Finland and the city of Turku. Volunteers arrived from Hungary, Italy and Estonia. 350 American nationals of Finnish background volunteered, and 210 volunteers of other nationalities arrived in Finland before the war ended. Max Manus, a Norwegian, fought in the Winter War before returning to Norway and later achieved fame as a resistance fighter during the German occupation of Norway. In total, Finland received 12,000 volunteers, 50 of whom died during the war. The British actor Christopher Lee volunteered in the war for 2 weeks, but did not face combat. White émigrés and Russian prisoners of war. Finland officially refused overtures from the anti-Soviet Russian All-Military Union, ROVS, for aid. Nevertheless, Mannerheim eventually agreed to establish a small Russian detachment, Russkaya Narodnaya Armia, RNA, of 200 men after being introduced to Boris Baranov, a high-ranking ROVS member, in person in January 1940. The project was deemed top secret, and was under the auspices of the Intelligence Division of the Finnish Army Headquarters. The ranks of RNA were to be filled by prisoners of war, but it would be commanded by white émigrés instead of captured Soviet Army officers, who were deemed unreliable. Baranov's Finnish assistant Fyodor Shulgin chose Captain Vladimir Kiselev, Lieutenant Vladimir Lugovskoy, Anatoly Budyansky and brothers Nikolai and Vladimir Barstamov as officers for the unit. Of the 5, the Barstamovs were not Finnish citizens, but had Nansen passports. The prisoners of war were trained in Huuhtanen, although it is possible that some were also trained in Lempala. RNA never participated in battle, despite Boris Baranov's later claims to the contrary in his memoirs. About 35 to 40 members of it were present during a battle in Ruskala in early March 1940, where they spread flyers and broadcast propaganda to encircled Soviet troops, but did not carry weapons. The men were subsequently detained by Finnish forces, who mistook them for Soviet infiltrators. After the war's end, Baranov was immediately asked to leave Finland, which he did. Finnish military historian Carl Geist presumes that most members of the RNA were executed after they were returned to the Soviet Union after the war. Additionally, Vladimir Barstamov was later extradited into the Soviet Union as one of the Lino prisoners in 1945, and was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. He was released after Stalin's death and returned to Finland in 1956. Franco-British intervention plans. France had been one of the earliest supporters of Finland during the Winter War. The French saw an opportunity to weaken Germany's resource imports via a Finnish counteroffensive, as both Sweden and the Soviet Union were strategic trading partners to Germany. France had another motive, preferring to have a major war in a remote part of Europe rather than on French soil. France planned to rearm the Polish exile units and transport them to the Finnish Arctic port of Petsamo. Another proposal was a massive airstrike with Turkish cooperation against the Caucasus oilfields. The British, for their part, wanted to block the flow of iron ore from Swedish mines to Germany, as the Swedes supplied up to 40% of Germany's iron demand. The matter was raised by British Admiral Reginald Plunkett on 18 September 1939, and the next day Winston Churchill brought up the subject in the Chamberlain War Cabinet. On the 11th of December, Churchill opined that the British should gain a foothold in Scandinavia with the objective to help the Finns, but without a war with the Soviet Union. Because of the heavy German reliance on northern Sweden's iron ore, Hitler had made it clear to the Swedish government in December that any Allied troops on Swedish soil would immediately provoke a German invasion. On the 19th of December, French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier introduced his plan to the General Staff and the War Cabinet. In his plan, Daladier created linkage between the war in Finland and the iron ore in Sweden. There was a danger of Finland's possible fall under Soviet hegemony. In turn, Nazi Germany could occupy both Norway and Sweden. These two powers could divide Scandinavia between them, as they had already done with Poland. The main motivation of the French and the British was to reduce German war-making ability. The Military Coordination Committee met on the 20th of December in London, and 2 days later, the French plan was put forward. The Anglo-French Supreme War Council elected to send notes to Norway and Sweden on the 27th of December, urging the Norwegians and Swedes to help Finland and offer the Allies their support. Norway and Sweden rejected the offer on the 5th of January 1940. The Allies came up with a new plan, in which they would demand that Norway and Sweden give them right of passage by citing a League of Nations resolution as justification. The expedition troops would disembark at the Norwegian port of Narvik and proceed by rail toward Finland, passing through the Swedish orefields on the way. This demand was sent to Norway and Sweden on the 6th of January, but it was likewise rejected 6 days later. Stymied but not yet dissuaded from the possibility of action, the Allies formulated a final plan on the 29th of January. First, the Finns would make a formal request for assistance. Then, the Allies would ask Norway and Sweden for permission to move the volunteers across their territory. Finally, to protect the supply line from German actions, the Allies would send units ashore at Namsos, Bergen, and Trondheim. The operation would have required 100,000 British and 35,000 French soldiers with naval and air support. The supply convoys would sail on the 12th of March and the landings would begin on the 20th of March. The end of the war on the 13th of March cancelled Franco-British plans to send troops to Finland through northern Scandinavia. Aftermath and casualties. Finland. The 105-day war had a profound and depressing effect in Finland. Meaningful international support was minimal and arrived late, and the German blockade had prevented most armament shipments. The 15-month period between the Winter War and Operation Barbarossa, part of which was the Continuation War, was later called the Interim Peace. After the end of the war, the situation of the Finnish army on the Karelian Isthmus became a subject of debate in Finland. Orders had already been issued to prepare a retreat to the next line of defense in the Taipale sector. Estimates of how long the Red Army could have been delayed by retreat and stand operations varied from a few days to a few weeks, or to a couple of months at most. Immediately after the war, Helsinki officially announced 19,576 dead. According to revised estimates in 2005 by Finnish historians, 25,904 people died or went missing and 43,557 were wounded on the Finnish side during the war. Finnish and Russian researchers have estimated that there were 801,100 Finnish prisoners of war, of whom between 10 and 20% died. The Soviet Union repatriated 847 Finns after the war. Air raids killed 957 civilians. Between 20 and 30 tanks were destroyed and 62 aircraft were lost. Also, Finland had to cede all ships of the Finnish Ladoga naval detachment to the Soviet Union by virtue of the Moscow Peace Treaty. During the interim peace, Finland aimed to improve its defensive capabilities and conducted negotiations with Sweden on a military alliance, but negotiations ended once it became clear that both Germany and the Soviet Union opposed such an alliance. On 31 July 1940, German Chancellor Adolf Hitler gave the order to plan an assault on the Soviet Union, and so Germany had to reassess its position regarding Finland. Until then, Germany had rejected Finnish appeals to purchase arms. However, the prospect of an invasion of the Soviet Union reversed the policy. In August, the secret sale of weapons to Finland was permitted. Karelian evacuees established an interest group, the Finnish Karelian League, to defend Karelian rights and interests and to find a way to return ceded regions of Karelia to Finland. Finland wished to re-enter the war mainly because of the Soviet invasion of Finland during the Winter War, which had taken place after Finland had failed by relying on the League of Nations and on Nordic neutrality. Finland aimed primarily to reverse its territorial losses from the Moscow Peace Treaty and, depending on the success of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, possibly to expand its borders, especially into East Karelia. Some right-wing groups, such as the academic Karelia Society, supported a Greater Finland ideology. The Continuation War began in June 1941 and led to Finnish participation in the Siege of Leningrad as well as the Finnish occupation of East Karelia. Soviet Union. The Soviet General Staff Supreme Command, Stavka, met in April 1940, reviewed the lessons of the Finnish campaign and recommended reforms. The role of frontline political commissars was reduced, and old-fashioned ranks and forms of discipline were reintroduced. Clothing, equipment and tactics for winter operations were improved. Not all of the reforms had been completed when Germans initiated Operation Barbarossa 14 months later. Between the Winter War and perestroika in the late 1980s, Soviet historiography relied solely on Molotov's speeches on the Winter War. In his radio speech of 29 November 1939, Molotov argued that the Soviet Union had tried to negotiate guarantees of security for Leningrad for 2 months. The Finns had taken a hostile stance to please foreign imperialists. Finland had undertaken military provocation, and the Soviet Union could no longer abide by the non-aggression pacts. According to Molotov, the Soviet Union did not want to occupy or annex Finland, but the goal was purely to secure Leningrad. The official Soviet figure, with reference to the command of the Leningrad military district, was published at a session of the Supreme Soviet on 26 March 1940, with 48,475 dead and 158,863 sick and wounded. More recent Russian estimates vary. In 1990, Mikhail Semiriaga claimed 53,522 dead, and N.I. Baryshnikov, 53,500. In 1997, Grigory Krivosheyev claimed 126,875 dead and missing and total casualties of 391,783, with 188,671 wounded. In 1991, Yuri Kilin claimed 63,990 dead and total casualties of 271,528. In 2007, he revised the estimate of dead to 134,000 and in 2012, he updated the estimate to 138,533. In 2013, Pavel Petrov stated that the Russian State Military Archive has a database confirming 167,976 killed or missing along with the soldiers' names, dates of birth and ranks. Nikita Khrushchev stated in his memoirs that over 1 million Soviet soldiers were killed. There were 5,572 Soviet prisoners of war in Finland. After the Winter War, the Soviet prisoners were returned to the USSR in accordance with the Moscow Peace Treaty. Of these, 450 were released, 4,354 were sentenced to imprisonment in labor camps ranging from 3 to 10 years and 414 were exposed to be active in traitorous activities while in captivity, with 334 criminal cases being transferred to the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union. 232 of those cases ended in a death penalty. Between 1,200 and 3,543 Soviet tanks were destroyed. The official figure was 611 tank casualties, but Yuri Kilin found a note received by the head of the Soviet General Staff, Boris Shaposhnikov, reporting 3,543 tank casualties and 316 tanks destroyed. According to Finnish historian Otto Mannerheim, the 7th Soviet Army lost 1,244 tanks during the breakthrough battles of the Mannerheim Line in midwinter. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Finnish estimate of the number of lost Soviet tanks was 1,000 to 1,200. The Soviet Air Forces lost around 1,000 aircraft, but fewer than half of them were combat casualties. According to Carl Fredrik Geist, based on the studies of Soviet Air Force units, Finnish anti-aircraft units shot down 119 and Finnish fighter pilots 131 Soviet aircraft, though all Soviet aircraft losses had been more than 900. Germany. The Winter War was a political success for the Germans. Both the Red Army and the League of Nations were humiliated, and the Anglo-French Supreme War Council had been revealed to be chaotic and powerless. The German policy of neutrality was unpopular in the homeland, and relations with Italy had suffered. After the Moscow Peace Treaty, Germany improved its ties with Finland, and within 2 weeks, Finnish-German relations were at the top of the agenda. More importantly, the very poor performance of the Red Army convinced Hitler that an invasion of the Soviet Union would be successful. In June 1941, Hitler declared, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Allies. The Winter War laid bare the disorganization and ineffectiveness of the Red Army and that of the Allies. The Anglo-French Supreme War Council was unable to formulate a workable plan, revealing its unsuitability to make effective war in either Britain or France. This failure led to the collapse of the Third Daladier government in France and the nomination of Paul Reynaud as the new Prime Minister of France.